Blood doesn't boil. It freezes. That's what they never tell you about absolute suffocating rage. When the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association slipped a foreclosure notice under my cabin door over a cord of unapproved firewood, I didn't yell. I just remembered who underwrote the title insurance for their entire subdivision. Wood splits with a clean, sharp crack if you hit it dead center, miss the grain by a fraction of an inch, and the maul bounces off, sending a jarring vibration straight up your forearms, settling deep into your shoulders. I missed the grain. Pain flared in my right elbow, a dull throb that tasted like old copper in the back of my throat. I dropped the heavy iron maul into the damp dirt and wiped a mixture of sweat and sawdust from my forehead with the back of a filthy leather glove. Autumn in this part of the country doesn't arrive gracefully. It slams into the mountains, bringing a biting wind that smells of decaying pine needles and wet granite. I loved it. I loved the harshness of it, the isolation. The cabin sitting behind me was a testament to that isolation. My grandfather built it in 1974 with his own 2 hands and a lot of cheap, rough-hewn cedar. It wasn't a rustic retreat for wealthy tech executives. It was a leaky, drafty A-frame that smelled permanently of cold ash, damp wool, and the faint, musky lingering of field mice. It was ugly. It was mine. I kicked the stubborn log aside and walked up the 3 wooden steps to the porch. The boards groaned, a familiar, comforting sound. I reached for the tarnished brass handle of the front door, and that's when I saw it. A stark, white envelope. It was taped right above the deadbolt. Heavy stock, expensive linen weave. It looked entirely alien against the weathered graying grain of the cedar door. It smelled faintly of laser printer toner and generic floral hand lotion. I ripped it off, the tape taking a small splinter of wood with it, and tore the flap open with my thumb. The letterhead was embossed in a pretentious gold foil. Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I stood on the porch, the wind whipping through my thin flannel shirt, and read the words. Then I read them again. My vision blurred slightly at the edges, a physiological response to a sudden, massive spike in cortisol. Dear property owner, it has come to the attention of the board that your property, designated as Lot 0, grandfathered, is in severe and repeated violation of the Whispering Pines community covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs. It went on. A laundry list of absurdities. The cord of firewood stacked on my own front porch constituted an unapproved visual eyesore. The color of my roof, rusted tin, was out of compliance with the earth tone mandate. My 1998 Ford Ranger parked in the dirt driveway was classified as an abandoned derelict vehicle. But the bottom of the page was where the real gut punch waited. They had been assessing fines for 6 months. Fines I had never received notices for. $50 a day for the wood. $100 a day for the truck. Late fees. Administrative penalties. Interest. The total sat at a staggering $18,450. Below that number, in bold, aggressive type, due to failure to remit payment, the association has placed a lien on the property. We have initiated foreclosure proceedings. You have 14 days to vacate the premises or face eviction by the county sheriff. My stomach hollowed out. A cold, clammy sweat broke across my chest. It wasn't the heroic, fiery anger you see in movies. It was the terrified, scrambling panic of a trapped animal. This cabin was the only thing I had left after a brutal divorce and a decade of grinding, soul-crushing corporate work. It was my sanctuary. And these people, these strangers in their beige, vinyl-sided McMansions, less than a mile down the mountain, were trying to steal it over firewood. I walked inside. The cabin was freezing. I didn't bother lighting the stove. I sat on the edge of the sagging plaid sofa, the springs digging into my thigh, and stared at the paper. The sheer audacity of it. The clinical, bloodless language of corporate theft. Whispering Pines was a relatively new development. A cancer of identical, sprawling houses that had chewed its way up the mountain over the last 5 years, stopping right at my property line. They had paved over the old logging roads, put up a massive faux stone entrance gate, and named their streets things like Tranquility Lane and Meadowbrook Way, despite destroying the meadow and paving over the brook. When they built it, The developers had tried to buy my 12 acres. I told them to go to hell, so they built around me. I was a donut hole in their pristine, manicured pastry. Legally, I wasn't part of their HOA. I never signed their CC&Rs, but they had money, they had lawyers, and they clearly had a plan. I crumpled the letter in my fists, the sharp edges of the thick paper digging into my palm. The panic was slowly receding, leaving behind a hard, dense core of resentment. I needed to look these people in the eye. I needed to see the faces of the people trying to render me homeless. Tuesday evening, the Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse. Pulling my dusty Ford into the parking lot felt like steering a garbage scow into a yacht club. The lot was full of pristine European SUVs and heavy-duty trucks that had never seen a speck of mud. I cut the engine. It sputtered, coughed, and died with a metallic rattle that echoed across the quiet, overly lit asphalt. I stepped out. The air here didn't smell like pine trees anymore. It smelled like hot asphalt, chemically treated lawn fertilizer, and the heavy, sweet scent of dryer sheets venting from a nearby house. It was suffocating. The clubhouse was a monument to suburban excess, high ceilings, fake wood beams, and a massive wall of windows overlooking a glowing, over-chlorinated pool. I pushed through the heavy glass doors. The air conditioning hit me like a physical wall, chilling the sweat on my neck. The lobby was carpeted in a thick, sound-dampening beige material that generated static electricity with every step. I followed the murmur of voices to the executive meeting room. Inside, about 30 people sat in rows of cheap metal folding chairs that scraped harshly against the linoleum floor. At the front, sitting behind a long folding table, draped in a maroon plastic tablecloth, was the board. 3 men and 2 women. They looked exactly like you'd expect. Crisp polo shirts, expensive watches, and expressions of bored absolute authority. The woman in the center, flanked by stacks of neatly organized manila folders, was speaking into a microphone she didn't need. Moving on to agenda item 4, she said, her voice a nasal, grating drone. The installation of the new speed bumps on Serenity Boulevard. I walked down the center aisle. My boots were heavy, the leather scuffed and caked with dried mud. I didn't try to be quiet. Every eye in the room turned toward me. The silence that fell over the room was thick and immediate. The woman at the center of the table stopped speaking. She looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. She wore a pastel pink cardigan and a frosted pink lipstick that belonged in a different decade. Her hair was sprayed into a rigid, immovable helmet. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with rehearsed condescension. "This is a closed meeting for residents of Whispering Pines." "I am a resident," I said. My voice sounded rough, scraping against the sterile acoustic tiles of the ceiling. "Arthur Pendleton. I own the cabin at the end of the access road." Recognition flashed in her eyes. It wasn't surprise. It was the predatory gleam of a spider feeling a tug on its web. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "Ah, Mr. Pendleton, I'm Amelia Carmichael, board president." She smiled. It wasn't a friendly thing. It was the mechanical parting of lips over teeth, designed to convey dominance. "I assume you received our correspondence." "I received a threat," I said, stopping a few feet from her table. I tossed the crumpled ball of linen paper onto the plastic tablecloth. It slowly expanded, like a dying flower. "You're trying to foreclose on a property that isn't even in your subdivision. I never signed your covenants. I don't belong to your HOA." A man sitting to Amelia's right, thinning hair, aggressively shiny golf shirt, scoffed. Check your deed, buddy. The developer annexed your access road 3 years ago. You use our road to get to your shack. You're bound by the dominant estate's master deed. It's called an implied restrictive covenant." I stared at him. "My grandfather built that road. We have a prescriptive easement. You can't just steal a man's land because you don't like his roof." Amelia sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation meant to show the audience how tedious I was. She picked up a thick binder, flipped it open, and ran a manicured fingernail down a page. "Mr. Pendleton, we are not stealing anything. We are enforcing community standards. Your property is a blight. It lowers the aggregate property values of Phase 3 by an estimated 4%. We offered to buy you out. You refused. Therefore, we amended the bylaws to include all adjacent parcels, utilizing community infrastructure. She looked up, her eyes flat and cold. You owe $18,000. You have 14 days to pay, or the sheriff will escort you off the premises. We already have the blueprints for the community tennis courts we're building on your lot. My jaw locked. The sheer, naked greed of it. They didn't care about the firewood. They wanted the land, and they had manufactured a paper trail to take it. I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to grab the microphone and scream. My hands shook, a fine tremor in the fingers that I desperately tried to hide by balling them into fists. I felt entirely outmatched. They had lawyers on retainer. They had binders full of legalese. I had a leaky roof and an empty bank account. You can't do this, I said. It sounded weak. It sounded like exactly what it was, a plea from a man who knew he was beaten. Amelia smiled again. We already have, Mr. Pendleton. Have a safe drive home. Please ensure your truck doesn't leak oil on our pavement on your way out. Someone in the back row chuckled. I turned and walked out. The walk back to the truck felt like miles. My boots felt like lead weights. I got in, slammed the door so hard the rearview mirrors shook, and gripped the steering wheel. The leather was cold and cracking under my fingers. I sat there in the dark, the neon glow of the clubhouse sign illuminating the dashboard, and let the humiliation wash over me. They thought I was just some hillbilly in the woods. They thought I was a bumpkin who couldn't read a contract, a guy they could easily steamroll with a few threatening letters and some pseudo-legal jargon. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. A long, shuddering breath escaped my lungs. They didn't know. Why would they? I drove a 25-year-old truck. I chopped my own wood. I wore flannels with holes in the elbows. When I came to the mountain, I left my other life behind entirely. I stripped away the suit, the tie, the relentless pressure, and became a ghost. I lifted my head and looked back at the clubhouse. The lights were bright, the shadows sharp. Amelia Carmichael and her board of sycophants had spent months digging through property laws, looking for a loophole to steal my home. They probably hired a real estate attorney for $300 an hour to draft that annexation document. They thought they had covered every base. They thought the paper trail was ironclad, but they didn't know what I did for a living down in the city, 3 hours away. I didn't just read contracts, I guaranteed them. I owned First Standard Title and Escrow. Wednesday morning, the air in my downtown office smelled of ozone from the massive commercial printers, stale break room coffee, and the faint, dusty scent of a million archived documents. It was a smell I usually hated. Today it smelled like ammunition. I sat behind my heavy mahogany desk, the city skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me. The contrast between this room and my cabin was absolute. Here, I wasn't the guy in the muddy boots. I was the guy holding the keys to the kingdom. In real estate, title insurance is the invisible bedrock. When you buy a house, you aren't just buying wood and bricks. You are buying the legal right to occupy that space. But land has history. Old mortgages, forgotten heirs, unrecorded easements, contractor liens, ghosts of the past that can rise up and claim your property. Title insurance guarantees that the seller actually owns what they are selling. If a ghost appears, my company pays the claim. Without title insurance, no bank on earth will issue a mortgage. We are the gatekeepers. And 4 years ago, First Standard Title and Escrow had won the exclusive contract to underwrite the entire Whispering Pines subdivision. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the heavy clack, clack, clack echoing in the quiet office. The dual monitors cast a harsh blue light across my face. I bypassed the standard employee portals and logged directly into the master underwriter database, pulling up the file for Whispering Pines, phases 1 through 4. Thousands of pages of documents populated on the screen: plat maps, master deeds, CC&Rs, corporate formation filings. I cracked my knuckles, a sharp pop in the quiet room. Huff. All right, Amelia, let's see how smart your lawyers really are. I started with the incorporation documents. An HOA is just a corporation. It has to be formed legally, maintained legally, and its powers are strictly limited by its charter. I read through the original 2018 filings, standard boilerplate, nothing glaring. I moved to the land surveys. The smell of old vellum and ink seemed to drift from the digital scans. I zoomed in on Phase 3, the section bordering my property. I traced the property lines, looking for the access road. There it was, a thin, gray line cutting through their green parcels. According to the blowhard at the meeting, they had annexed it via an implied restrictive covenant. I pulled up the amendment to their master deed, filed 18 months ago in the county clerk's office. Reading legal documents is like untangling a massive knot of fishing line. It requires patience, a tolerance for mind-numbing repetition, and an eye for the microscopic gaps where logic fails. I read for 2 hours. My coffee went cold. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me faded into white noise. Then I stopped. I leaned closer to the monitor. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, making sure the pixels weren't playing tricks on me. I read the paragraph again, and again. A slow, terrible smile stretched across my face. My heart thumped a heavy, rhythmic beat against my ribs. When Whispering Pines decided to annex my access road to force me into their HOA, they had to file a new plat map and an amended declaration of covenants with the county. But they didn't just add the road. To avoid paying a separate tax assessment on the new common area, Amelia and her board had legally dissolved the original Whispering Pines Homeowners Association entity and reformed it as a new corporation, rolling the new boundaries into the new entity. It was a clever tax dodge, but they made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. When you dissolve a corporation that holds title to land, in this case, all the common areas, the clubhouse, the pool, the roads, you have to legally transfer the deeds from the old entity to the new one. You have to sign the property over to yourself. They didn't. They reformed the HOA, but they left the title to every single street, sidewalk, and common area in the name of a corporation that legally no longer existed. The new HOA, the one Amelia was president of, didn't own a single blade of grass in the subdivision. They were a phantom entity, but it got worse. Much, much worse. I clicked over to my own company's files. The title insurance policies. When First Standard underwrote the subdivision, we issued a master policy that covered the developer and individual policies for every homeowner who bought a house. But title policies have strict conditions. They only remain valid as long as the legal structure of the ownership remains intact and uncorrupted by the insured party. By dissolving the original entity and failing to transfer the deeds, the HOA had broken the chain of title. They had created a massive, uninsurable defect on every single property in Whispering Pines. I leaned back in my leather chair. It squeaked loudly in the silent room. If a subdivision has no legally recognized access roads, because the roads are owned by a dead corporation, the houses are considered landlocked in the eyes of the law. A landlocked house is unmarketable. An unmarketable house violates the core covenant of every mortgage backed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. If I flagged this defect in the National Registry, I picked up my cold coffee, took a sip, and grimaced at the bitter, acidic taste. If I flagged this, every single title insurance policy in Whispering Pines would be suspended. The moment the policy's suspended, the banks holding the mortgages would receive an automated alert. The banks would see that the collateral for their $500,000 loans was suddenly unmarketable. They wouldn't just call the HOA. They would trigger the acceleration clauses in the mortgages. They would demand full repayment immediately. All 300 homes. Amelia hadn't just stepped in a bear trap. She had swallowed a hand grenade. And my thumb was resting on the pin. I minimized the window and opened a blank email. Draft. I addressed it to my chief underwriting counsel, a ruthlessly efficient lawyer named John, who lived for this exact type of paperwork bloodbath. John, review the attached files for Whispering Pines Phase 1 and 4. The HOA dissolved their originating corporate entity on March 12th of last year to annex an adjoining parcel, but failed to record quitclaim deeds for the common infrastructure. Chain of title is severed. Access roads are currently owned by a defunct entity. We have a total failure of marketability. Draft a notice of policy suspension for all 312 parcels. Prepare the mandatory disclosures for the mortgage lenders. Do not send yet. I want the paperwork sitting on my desk by tomorrow morning. I hit send. The anger I had felt on the porch yesterday was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, calculating calm. Amelia Carmichael wanted to use paperwork to steal a cabin that meant everything to me. She was about to find out what happens when you weaponize the law against someone who writes the rulebook. I grabbed my jacket, shut down my monitors, and walked out of the office. I had a long drive back to the mountain, and for the first time in days, I was looking forward to it. Thursday brought a cold front that settled heavy and damp over the mountain. I spent the morning splitting the rest of the offending firewood. My elbow still throbbed, a steady, rhythmic pulse of pain that kept me grounded. The physical labor was necessary. It burned off the residual adrenaline from the city, the lingering, toxic energy of the corporate world I had just weaponized. I stacked the split cedar on the porch, deliberately placing the pieces so the rough, lighter wood faced the road. It smelled sharply of resin and wet earth, a petty visual rebellion. Inside the cabin was quiet. Just the hiss of the wind through the loose window panes and the low, popping crackle of the wood stove. I sat at the small, scarred kitchen table. My laptop sat open, a sleek, silver anomaly against the raw timber and worn wool blankets. At 1:14 p.m. my phone vibrated against the wood, a harsh buzzing that made my teeth ache. An email from John. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained 3 words: "Notices are drafted." Attached were 312 individual PDF files, plus one massive master disclosure document formatted for the mortgage electronic registration systems. I opened the master file. It was a masterpiece of clinical, bureaucratic devastation. No anger, no emotion, just a cold recitation of legal facts. Failure of conveyancing, severed chain of title, suspension of underwriting guarantees. I stared at the screen. Oh, a strange, heavy, hollow feeling expanded in my chest. I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought I would taste some kind of vindication. Instead, I just felt tired. I was about to detonate a financial bomb that would terrify hundreds of families down the mountain. Most of them were just normal people who wanted a nice lawn and a quiet street. They didn't know Amelia Carmichael had used their dues to fund a land grab. But I looked up at the wall above the stove. A framed, faded photograph hung slightly crooked. My grandfather standing in front of this very cabin, covered in sawdust, holding a framing hammer. He built this place because he wanted to be left alone. He bled into this dirt. I looked back at the screen. They struck first. They tried to take my home over a cord of firewood. I typed a reply to John. Execute. I closed the laptop, pushed back the table, and poured myself a glass of cheap, warm bourbon. It burned on the way down, a harsh scratch against the back of my throat. I sat on the sagging sofa and waited. Oh no, the silence of the mountain didn't change, but down in the valleys, in the server rooms of Chase, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, an automated apocalypse was unfolding. When a title insurance policy is suspended on a mortgaged property, the lender's risk management software flags it immediately. A house without a clear title cannot be foreclosed upon easily, meaning the bank's collateral is essentially zeroed out. The system doesn't wait for human intervention. It acts to protect the bank's assets. Friday morning, the symptoms started showing. I was on the porch, drinking black coffee that tasted mostly of aluminum from my old percolator, when the first sign arrived. Down in the subdivision, a massive moving truck that had been parked in a driveway for 2 days suddenly started its engine and began rolling slowly back toward the highway. A family trying to close on the sale of their home. The bank would have frozen the escrow account an hour before signing. The buyer's loan was dead. The sale was vaporized. By noon, my phone was ringing. I didn't answer. I let it ring. First, it was unknown numbers, then a local 555 area code. Over and over, the digital chirping felt frantic, a sharp contrast to the slow, lazy drift of the gray clouds overhead. At 2:30 p.m. At 30 p.m. the noise arrived in person. I heard the engine before I saw the car. It wasn't the smooth, quiet hum of a luxury vehicle. It was the high-pitched, desperate whine of a transmission being pushed too hard up a steep, rutted dirt grade. A silver Lexus SUV burst through the tree line, bouncing violently over a deep pothole. The front bumper scraped the gravel with a terrible, tearing crunch. The car slammed to a halt a few yards from my truck, kicking up a thick cloud of yellow dust that drifted lazily toward my porch. The driver's door flew open. Amelia Carmichael stumbled out. The rigid, pastel perfection of Tuesday night was entirely gone. She wore a wrinkled linen blouse. Her hair, usually an immovable helmet, was flattened on one side and frizzy on the other. But it was her face that told the real story. The makeup couldn't hide the chalky, bloodless pallor of her skin. She slammed the door shut, ignoring the dust settling on her expensive shoes, and marched toward my porch. Her hands were shaking so violently, she had to clench them against her thighs. "What did you do?" she screamed. Her voice was shrill, cracking at the edges. It echoed off the pine trees, disturbing a murder of crows that took flight with a clatter of black wings. I didn't stand up. I stayed seated in the old, peeling wicker chair. The ceramic mug resting on my knee was cold, the coffee inside covered by a thin, oily film. "Afternoon, Amelia," I said. My voice sounded flat, swallowed instantly by the vast, open space of the mountain. "You scratched your bumper." She stopped at the bottom of the steps. The heat radiating off the Lexus engine created a faint shimmer in the damp air behind her. I could hear the metal of the car's undercarriage pinging and ticking as it cooled. She looked like she wanted to physically attack me. Her chest heaved. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and framed by smudged mascara that made her look bruised. "My phone hasn't stopped ringing since 9 o'clock this morning," she gasped. Her breathing was shallow, a panicked flutter in her throat. "The community bank froze the HOA operating accounts. 3 home sales fell through today, and a man from Bank of America called me. He said the entire subdivision is in default." She grabbed the rough cedar handrail. She didn't seem to notice the splinters. Her knuckles turned a stark bone white. "He said First Standard Title pulled our insurance, all of it, over a severed chain of title. What did you do, Pendleton? Who do you know?" "I don't know anyone, Amelia," I said slowly. I took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like aluminum and regret, bitter and thin. "I own the company. I am the chief executive officer of First Standard." The words hit her with a physical weight. She actually took a half step backward, her designer heels sinking deep into the soft, muddy soil of my yard. Her mouth opened, closed, and opened again, working silently like a fish pulled onto a dock. The predatory spider from the clubhouse was entirely gone. In her place was just a woman watching her life catch fire. "You," she stammered, the absolute absurdity of the situation short-circuiting her brain. She looked at my scuffed work boots, the holes in my flannel, the rusted tin roof above my head. "You live in a shack. You drive a garbage truck." "I like my truck," I replied. "And I like my shack, which is why I told you to leave me alone. I told you I wasn't part of your world, but you wanted to play lawyer. You wanted to play king." I stood up. The wooden porch boards groaned under my boots. I walked to the edge of the steps, looking down at her. The smell of her expensive, heavy floral perfume was losing a war against the acrid, chemical scent of burnt transmission fluid baking off her car. "You dissolved the original corporation to avoid paying property taxes on the newly annexed land," I said, dropping the casual tone. My voice hardened, brittle and sharp. "Oh, you failed to record the quitclaim deeds for the roads and common areas. The entity that owns the asphalt you drove on to get here doesn't legally exist anymore. Your houses are landlocked, legally inaccessible, unmarketable. You broke your own chain of title, Amelia. I didn't fabricate anything. I just reported it to the lenders." "You can't do this," she shrieked. The panic finally broke through the shock, raw and ugly. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror welled in her eyes and spilled over. "You're destroying us. The banks are threatening to accelerate the mortgages. People will lose their homes. Good people." "I'm not destroying you," I said, but the emptiness in my chest was spreading, a heavy, sinking stone in my gut. "You did this to yourselves. You weaponized the CC&Rs to steal my property. You generated fake fines. You tried to force a foreclosure on a man you thought was too poor and too stupid to fight back. You thought the law was a club you could swing at anyone you didn't like. You just swung at the wrong guy. She started to cry. It wasn't a delicate weeping. It was ragged, gasping sobs that violently shook her shoulders. She reached out, gripping the porch rail with both hands now, leaning heavily against it like a lifeline. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked, a desperate, raspy sound. "Please, Arthur, I have a mortgage. I have 2 kids in college. If the bank calls my loan, if we lose the house, my husband will leave me. We'll have nothing." I looked at her. Really looked at her. The anger that had been keeping me warm for the last 3 days evaporated, leaving me cold and utterly exhausted. I didn't see a villain anymore. I saw a terrified, petty, middle-aged woman who had let a tiny fraction of suburban power go to her head and was now staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. And looking at her, I felt a deep, sickening wave of disgust, not just at her, at me, at the whole miserable, paper-pushing system we both inhabited. I came to this mountain to escape the corporate bloodletting, to get away from a world where lives were ruined with the stroke of a pen. Yet here I was doing exactly that. My sanctuary felt tainted. I had dragged the very thing I hated right up to my own front door to save it. "I don't want your houses, Amelia," I said quietly. The wind picked up, rustling the dry, dead pine needles in the canopy above us. "I just want to chop my wood in peace." She looked up, mascara running down her cheeks in thin, jagged black rivulets. "How do we fix it?" "You," I emphasized the word, making sure she held my gaze, "are going to hire a very expensive corporate real estate attorney. You are going to file a retroactive deed transfer with the county clerk, petitioning a district judge to recognize the continuous operation of the entity to cure the defect. It will take months. It will cost your HOA tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. You will probably have to levy a special assessment on your entire neighborhood to pay for it." She swallowed hard, wiping her face with the back of a trembling, dirt-streaked hand. She nodded once. "And," I continued, stepping back from the ledge, "before you do any of that, your board is going to hold an emergency meeting tonight. You are going to draft an ironclad, legally binding exclusion, exempting my parcel from any and all current or future Whispering Pines covenants, easements, or annexations. You will wipe the $18,000 in fines. You will remove the lien. You will pay my company's standard hourly rate of $600 an hour for the title review that uncovered your mess. And you will never, ever look in the direction of this cabin again." Amelia nodded frantically, the movement jerky and desperate. Yes, whatever you want. I'll get the board together right now. Just, please, call the banks, call the underwriters, tell them we're fixing it, tell them not to foreclose. "Get the exclusion drafted and signed by a notary," I said, turning my back on her and walking toward the front door. "Bring it to me by Monday. Once it's recorded with the county clerk, First Standard will issue a temporary binder to the lenders, staying the suspension while you fix your title defect." I walked back to the kitchen table, leaving the door wide open to the damp mountain air. "Monday, Amelia," I called out without looking back. "Drive slow on the way down. The potholes are a bitch." I listened to her heels drag through the gravel. I heard the heavy, solid thunk of the expensive car door slamming shut. The Lexus engine revved, whining in high-pitched protest as she awkwardly executed a frantic 3-point turn in my narrow, rutted driveway. The sound of the tires spinning in the dirt faded slowly down the mountain, eventually replaced by the rush of the wind and the distant, rhythmic chirping of the late-season crickets. I sat back down at the scarred wooden table. The laptop was still there, a cold block of aluminum sitting next to a pile of unpaid electric bills. There was no grand victory march, no swelling sense of triumph, just the lingering foul smell of burnt transmission fluid and the dull, relentless ache deep in my right elbow. The system was ugly, though. It was a massive, blind machine that ground people down into dust, and I knew how to pull the levers better than she did. That was the only difference between us. I was just a bigger monster in a worse shirt. I reached out and pushed the laptop away. The rubber feet squeaked harshly against the wood. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I didn't want to think about deeds, or covenants, or suspension notices. I walked back out to the porch, grabbed the heavy iron maul from the dirt, and stared at a fresh block of cedar resting on the chopping stump. The afternoon air was turning frigid, biting through my thin flannel, carrying the promise of a hard frost. I raised the maul high above my head, letting the cold iron weight pull my tight shoulders back, stretching the cramped muscles. I swung down, aiming perfectly, hitting the grain dead center. The wood split with a loud, violent crack that echoed down the mountain, ringing clear and sharp against the encroaching silence. Have you ever had an HOA step over the line? Drop your horror stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed watching a corrupt board get crushed under the weight of their own paperwork, hit that like button, share this video with anyone suffering under neighborhood tyrants, and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of sweet, bureaucratic justice. Don't let them push you around. Know your rights, and we'll see you in the next one.